Many thanks for joining us for the 2025 Besterman Lecture of the Voltaire Foundation. My name is Avi Lifshitz. I teach 18th century European history here at Magdalen College and at the history faculty. And I'm glad to welcome you also on behalf of Nicholas Kronk, director of the Voltaire Foundation, and the successor of Theodore Besterman, one of his successors. Besterman was the founder of the Voltaire Foundation, and upon his death almost 50 years ago in 1976, the Voltaire Foundation became part of the University of Oxford, where of course it is still based and going strong. We're extremely happy to introduce Antoine Lilti as our Besterman Lecture for 2025. Professor Antoine Lilti of the Collège de France is a graduate of the École Normale Supérieure. He wrote his doctoral thesis under Daniel Roche on the world of the salons, which was the basis of his first book published in French in 2005 and in an English translation in 2015. And already there, Antoine showed us a phenomenon that we thought we knew well from a brand new perspective. Rather than a beacon of Enlightenment sociability and the modern public sphere, Antoine demonstrated that the salons were more significant as nodes of aristocratic hobnobbing and ancien regime hierarchies of power. His second book, Figure Publique, in 2014, was translated into English as The Invention of Celebrity in 2017. And there, Antoine traced the emergence of a new form of public recognition and fame predicated on changes in the public sphere and individual identities. This book was followed by L'Héritage des Lumières, Ambivalence de la Modernité, 2019, a brilliant collection of essays that really highlighted the paradoxical aspects of the Enlightenment, the very complex historiography of the Enlightenment, and of course the uneasy relationship between Enlightenment and the M word, modernity. An English translation will be published in January 26, in 2 months, by the University of Chicago Press as The Legacy of the Enlightenment. And finally, just 2 months ago, Antoine published a fascinating account of the first contacts between Europeans and Polynesians in the Pacific and the presence of travelers, of Polynesian travelers in Europe in the 18th century. The title is The Illusion of a Common World, L'illusion d'un monde commun, pardon my French, and it is published by Flammarion. While working on all these projects and before his elevation to the Collège de France, Antoine taught at the École Normale Supérieure and later at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Of course, I could go on and tell you about his numerous fascinating articles and editorial projects, but of course we have a lecture to listen to. And the title is 3 Languages of Universalism, Thinking Globally in the Enlightenment. Antoine Lilti, thank you for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Avi, for this very kind presentation. I want also to thank Nicholas Kronk and the Voltaire Foundation for inviting me to give this Besterman lecture. It's really an honor for me to be here tonight in this wonderful setting, and thank you all for attending the lecture. As you well know, the Enlightenment has never referred only to an intellectual movement situated in the 18th century, but also to a set of values, references, and works which continue to this day to spark debates, controversies, and sometimes even passionate pledges. In this respect, the Enlightenment constitutes a political legacy as much as a historiographical category. At times, this legacy has been conflated with that of liberal democracy, sometimes with that of the scientific revolution and the philosophy of progress, and at other times with that of secularized modernity and the disenchantment of the world. Since the end of the 20th century, a further dividing line has been established. The main debate over the legacy of the Enlightenment now concerns its claim to universalism. The context for this, obviously, is the crisis of Western hegemony. The emergence in the second half of the 20th century of a multipolar world, the acceleration of economic and cultural globalization, and the end of the grand narratives of modernity, accentuated by the ecological crisis, raised the question of whether the Enlightenment really was a force for human emancipation. The Enlightenment has been widely criticized, notably by post-colonial thinkers. It has been accused of being too often the mask of Western domination and of having served as the vehicle for the imposition of European ideas by force across the world. In turn, advocates of the Enlightenment, mostly in North America and in Europe, has reaffirmed its universalist values grounded in individual rights and in the autonomy of the human person. They have sought to dissociate European colonialism from the Enlightenment, recalling that the philosophers of the 18th century often fought against imperialism and slavery, and that the Enlightenment, in fact, provided theoretical weapons for the colonization movement. They have reaffirmed the classical identification of the Enlightenment with cosmopolitanism, secularization, and tolerance, and contrasted it with the new claims of identity politics and the returns of religious fanaticism. This debate, however, has too often relied on a caricatural vision of the Enlightenment, which has been confused with 19th century philosophies of history, or even more generally with the modernizing and imperialist ideology of the West, without paying due attention to the plurality and polyphony of the Enlightenment itself. Furthermore, the notion of universalism is notoriously polysemous. Some authors criticize the philosophers of the Enlightenment for not being sufficiently universalistic, and they seek out racist or sexist prejudices in their writings. Others criticize them, on the contrary, for being too universalistic, with universalism appearing here as a desire to impose the same cultural and political models on everyone. In the first case, the Enlightenment is accused of failing to live up to its own egalitarian ideals. In the second case, it is the very principle of universal values that appears to be illegitimate and to constitute a form of epistemic and political violence. Of course, there is currently much philosophical debate about the contributions and limitation of universalism in the contemporary world, with some authors seeking to develop an alternative universalism now defined by cultural plurality, the recognition of others, exchange, and translation. This is the case, for example, of the philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who draws upon Maurice Merleau-Ponty's distinction between the vertical universalism, on the one hand, which purports to impose a singular truth through a discourse that praises uniformity, and, on the other hand, an horizontal universalism which takes into account the diversity of cultures and can be reached, as Merleau-Ponty wrote, through, I quote, the perpetual testing of oneself by the other and the other by oneself. Or, in Souleymane Bachir Diagne's words, the inscription of the world's plurality on a common horizon. Today, I would like to propose a different move, to return to 18th century texts themselves in order to understand what conception of universality the Enlightenment thinkers claimed. My thesis can be summarized as such, Enlightenment universalism as a coherent doctrine does not exist. In fact, even the word universalism did not appear in 18th century texts. We find numerous occurrences of the adjective universal, as in universal history or universal law, but they fuel a plurality of discourses, sometimes complementary and often contradictory. Therefore, I propose to distinguish three different languages of universalism: a cosmopolitan universalism, a historical universalism, and finally, a critical universalism. These languages are not, strictly speaking, intellectual currents into which different authors can be sorted. I believe this mode of practicing intellectual history is now obsolete. Instead, they constitute sets of arguments as well as rhetorical resources with a fairly long legacy. Of course, for clarity, I will cite text and therefore authors, but it is important to understand that some writers perfectly well deploy different languages of universality in different texts, and sometimes in the same text. Let me begin first by recalling that the Enlightenment does not possess a monopoly on universality. Indeed, it was constructed in opposition to two traditional figures of universalism that have been very powerful in Western culture: Christianity on the one hand, and the universal monarchy on the other. The Enlightenment countered this with a new language based on religious pluralism and the moral autonomy of individuals. Truth is no longer revealed by sacred speech, nor imposed by imperial power, but must be discovered and recognized by each person. The content of truth remains universal, but this universality now lies at the level of the human being as a rational and sentient being. The universal is both the content of truth, that which concerns all human beings, and the means to access it, reason generally, and sometimes sentiment. Individuals are no longer called to submit to norms imposed by authority or tradition. Instead, they must be able to find them just and reasonable. Of course, you know all this, and this assent involved the critique of prejudice and superstition. If moral norms retained their universality, it was because human nature itself was the same for all, despite obvious physical, cultural, and social differences. This minimal foundation is shared by the various authors of the Enlightenment. Such a conception opens a space for debate, controversy, and intellectual confrontation far more than it offers a unified doctrine for conceiving universalist morality or politics. And that is why I propose to distinguish different languages of universality, and even perhaps I would say effects of universality, as Roland Barthes spoke of effects of reality, that is, theoretical and rhetorical devices that enable one to strive towards universality. I call cosmopolitan universalism the first of these three languages. It is rooted in a reflection on religious toleration, which was at the heart of European thought at the dawn of the Enlightenment, during what Paul Hazard termed the crisis of European consciousness. That is the period between 1680 and 1720. The two great texts of this period concerning toleration, of course, as you know, are John Locke's famous letter concerning toleration of 1689 and a somewhat lesser known text by Pierre Bayle, written while he was a refugee in Rotterdam in reaction to the revocation of the Edit de Nantes. Bayle's philosophical commentary on the words of Jesus Christ, compels them to come in, is an extraordinary manifesto for the rights of conscience and against any temptation to convert by force. Bayle did not rest with the classical doctrine of toleration, which endures the existence of heretics as a necessary evil. He went much further. No one can claim, in the name of reason, to possess religious truth. Only sincere and authentic faith, without external constraint, guarantees truth, but only an inner truth, which need not to be imposed upon others. The result is twofold. First, Bayle delivers a vibrant plea for religious pluralism, for what he calls bigarrure in French, against homogeneity. Religious diversity is no longer a threat, as in medieval Christian universalism, but a wealth, since toleration based on reason has become the new universal. Second, this diversity emancipates itself from the boundaries of Christendom, opening its scope to Jews, Muslims, and even atheists. Bayle even raises the hypothesis of Muslim missionaries sent by the Turks to Europe, and he affirms that they should be accepted with reciprocity. That is, I quote in French, and you have the English translation on the screen. Ainsi, s'il prenait fantaisie au mufti d'envoyer en chrétienté quelques missionnaires, comme le pape en envoie dans les Indes, et que l'on surprit ces missionnaires turcs s'insinuant dans les maisons pour y faire le métier de convertisseurs, je ne pense pas qu'on fût en droit de les punir. After all, Europeans do the same when sending Christian missionaries to Japan. That was a Bayle argument. As Rainer Forst has shown, Bayle articulated questions that would span the entire 18th century. Once reason had taken the place of religion as the basis for common morality and for regulating social behavior, what place should religions occupy in the social order? Should they be regarded as dangerous and useless, fundamentally tied to superstition and fanaticism? And this was, as you know, the answer of materialists and atheists like, for example, D'Holbach. Should they be removed of dogmas, retaining only their common base, that of a universal morality, an approach that leads from deism to what Kant will call at the end of the century religion within the bounds of bare reason? Or should faith and revealed religion be given a place, yet so roughly separated from social order? And if so, how is that order to be regulated once religion no longer ensures cohesion? Through mores, public opinion, law, or commerce. Yet, the essential question regarding universalism was the framing of moral issues at the scale of humanity, from the standpoint of the citizen of the world. And this cosmopolitan question concerned the ties that can or must be instituted beyond customary confessional, cultural, and political boundaries, on the basis not of a single faith, but of a common humanity. And there is a double movement at the core of cosmopolitanism, as the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has observed. First, one must recognize obligations to all other humans beyond kinship, friendship, or national ties, And in this respect, cosmopolitanism is truly a universalism. It thwarts boundaries, seeks openness and reciprocity. Second, it shows interest in the richness of cultural diversity, in the plurality of practices and beliefs that give meaning to human life. This universalism is neither an abstraction nor a desire for global cultural unification, but rather a way of confronting the truth of others, as the sociologist Ulrich Beck put it, that is, responding to the challenge posed by alterity. The success of cosmopolitan ideals in the 18th century was rooted in concrete changes in mobility and sociability, as Daniel Roche has shown in his Humeur vagabonde. The improvements of road and transportation facilitated travel, the vogue for the European Grand Tour, the development of big cities like Paris or London, fueled by the arrivals of provincials and foreigners, the networks of learned academies, the expansion of the periodical press, bringing news from Europe and from the world, and, of course, Freemasonry and its network of lodges. By the century's end, hundreds, perhaps thousands of lodges existed across Europe, in America, in the colonies, in the Caribbean, and in Mediterranean ports. They carried a fraternal transnational ideal which was called the Universal Republic of Freemasons, even if we know this universalism had its limits regarding women, Jews, and people of color. Still, the striking success of Freemasonry in the second half of the century points to the rooting of the cosmopolitan ideal grounded in travel, curiosity, and an ideal of sociability unfettered by traditional social constraints. More generally, 18th century Europe marked a shift from local societies, where mobility was exceptional, to more open, fluid societies. The great Enlightenment thinkers, Daniel Roche wrote, conceived the modernity of the Enlightenment as, I quote, as the passage from a situation dominated by communities relatively closed in on themselves to a universal age, one of worlds made interdependent by commerce and the action of Enlightenment values. End of quotation. The word cosmopolitan first appeared in French in the Trévoux dictionary in 1721, meaning a man to whom the world is a city or a homeland. I am a cosmopolitan, that is to say, a citizen of the universe. It gradually took on a double meaning, citizen of the world, and also a man without attachments, loving, therefore, neither place nor people. Rousseau denounced, such a philosopher loves the Tartars in order to be excused from loving his neighbors. In the latter half of the 18th century, the figure of the cosmopolitan increasingly stands opposed, for better and for worse, to the newly esteemed figure of the patriot. When the word enters the Academy Dictionary in 1762, it carries this meaning: cosmopolitan, one who does not choose a homeland. A cosmopolitan is not a good citizen. The ambiguity is evident in Fougeray de Montbron's novel, The Cosmopolitan, or The Citizen of the World, which features an ambivalent traveler at home everywhere, but attached nowhere, ultimately a cynical observer of human folly. I quote one sentence of the novel: I am an isolated being among the living. For me, the universe is a permanent spectacle where I entertain myself freely, and I see humans as acrobats who make me laugh now and then, though I neither love nor esteem them. Is the cosmopolitan necessarily a misanthrope? This is the risk. By freeing oneself from prejudices and natural communities, one paradoxically risks losing what makes us human, emotional ties with our peers. Other authors, however, affirm the value of the cosmopolitan ideal, especially in political and geopolitical context. Kant, for example, in his 1795 treatise, Toward Perpetual Peace, affirms the existence of a cosmopolitan right distinct from civil right and the law of nation. Cosmopolitan right without which world peace is impossible, regards individuals as citizens of a universal state of humanity, a state that does not exist politically, but is grounded in the existence of a single common world within which it is necessary to foster mutual relations in order to advance the unity of humankind. The foremost principle of cosmopolitan rights is universal hospitality, according to Kant, that is to say, the right of a foreigner upon arrival in another's territory not to be treated as an enemy. End of quotation. And it is also, as you know, what Kant called a right of visitation, carefully distinguished from colonial enterprises, which he condemned. Lessing's play Nathan the Wise offers a magnificent plea for cosmopolitan and tolerant universalism, developing Boccaccio's parable of the three rings. Toleration is presented as the ability to transcend cultural and religious differences, not to erase them, but to allow their peaceful coexistence in a human community enriched by difference and oriented towards the emulation of virtue. As Saladin says to the Templar, I quote, "Christian or Muslim, it doesn't matter. In a white cloak or a kaftan, with a turban or whatever headdress you wish, I never required that all trees have the same bark." In a powerful commentary of the play, Hannah Arendt saw in Lessing's play the form Enlightenment may assume when it strives to preserve the possibility of a common world thanks to the resources of language and friendship, even in dark time of war and terror. Alongside this language of toleration and cosmopolitanism, based on reciprocity in the present, Enlightenment thinkers developed another approach to the diversity of societies and culture, that is, through history. Whereas reason is universal, the capacity of individuals to make use of it depends on prevailing social, political, and cultural conditions. That is what I call the Enlightenment's historical universalism. For many philosophers and historians in the 18th century, the history of humanity was a movement from savage societies in which the human mind was still in its infancy to civilized ones where people are capable of understanding the world around them thanks to science and of understanding their own human natures thanks to philosophy. The neologism of civilization, a basic conceptual frame of Enlightenment historical thought, was developed precisely to describe this historical transformation of European societies. Certainly, universal histories in the 18th century were far from having the theoretical coherence they would acquire in the following century, for instance with Hegel or Marx, of course. They were uncertain as to the apparently unfinished or interrupted evolution of certain civilization, notably in India or China, and they were wary of progress going too far, as Silvia Sebastiani has stressed. However, their goal was to take into account the entire history of humanity in order to tell the story of a progressive move toward human autonomy driven by the progress of knowledge. The Scottish historians especially developed this idea of civilizational progress, conceived as a succession of historical stages, as in Adam Ferguson's History of Civil Society, and William Robertson, in his History of the Reign of Charles V, highlighted the turning point Europe experienced in the 16th century with the failure of the universal monarchy. David Hume argued that a system of rival but interdependent states in Europe enabled progress in arts and science. Of course, from Edinburgh to Paris, from Naples to Göttingen, this history of civilization took different forms. However, as Karen O'Brien and John Pocock has shown, besides their differences, this dominant historical narrative constitutes one of the essential structures of Enlightenment thought. It was then taken up and developed by Gibbon and later by Guizot in the early 19th century. In France, during the Revolution, Condorcet systematized this perspective in his historical sketch of the progress of the human mind, that vast fresco of human progress grounded in the doctrine of indefinite perfectibility. The narrative truly came to life in Europe from the Renaissance onwards, with the invention of printing, then the rise of sciences and philosophy, and finally the emergence of public opinion. I quote Condorcet, "Enlightenment became the object of an active universal commerce." Each people were supposed to go through the same historical process leading from savagery or barbarity to the age of reason. In this view, the history of Europe since the 16th century represented something of a paragon, a cumulative process of progress of arts and sciences, of trade and morals, had taken place there in Europe and only there. In fact, Europe served as a model by which to judge the progress of civilization as a whole. The measure of the universal was no longer the abstract individual, but the European man. In Voltaire's historical work, for example, which provided the matrix for this history, the base for this history of civilization, there was in Voltaire's work, there was a strong tension between a universalist principle that aimed to broaden history on a global scale and to stress the achievements of Eastern civilizations, especially in China and India, and on the other hand, a Eurocentric principle according to which, I quote, "everything is our business, everything is done for us." And by us, Voltaire, of course, meant the modern Europeans. How then was the expression of civilization on a global scale possible? Most philosophers rejected colonization as the violent imposition of European manners and norms, and they favored either a model of indigenous development of civilization through authoritarian political reforms, like those of Peter the Great in Russia, or a model of diffusion by commerce, both economic and intellectual commerce. Commerce would enable a social transformation that made liberty desirable and fostered individual autonomy. Europeans provided the model intended to inspire admiration and emulation, when Condorcet, at the end of the century, speculated about the propagation of the Enlightenment across the globe, he assured his readers that the universal path towards civilization would take the form of everyone imitating the most enlightened people. Liberty, he thought, would subjugate all people. Bientôt, la liberté s'élançant avec elle, des ailes assurées que la France et l'Amérique lui ont offertes, subjuguera tous les peuples dont les yeux, enfin dessillés, ne pourront plus les méconnaître. La méconnaître, je pense. It is easy to remark, to notice the ambiguity of the verb subjugate, subjuguer. It designated an intellectual and moral fascination, the irresistible moral power of the Western model, but it could also easily evoke a form of domination. Quite at the same moment, in 1789, in his 1789 inaugural lecture at Jena on universal history, Friedrich Schiller outlined the history of humanity from troglodyte savages to the excellence of the refined European of the 18th century. That's the quotation. This historical difference was also, of course, a geographical difference. The peoples of the world all shared in humanity, but they were not at the same stage of human development. The civilization gap did not only divide Europeans from the rest of the world. Inside Europe itself, it set up several fault lines. As Larry Wolff has shown, a mental gap opposed a Western and civilized Europe to an Eastern Europe that was still largely barbaric in Western European minds, that had barely emerged from serfdom, autocracy, and superstition. Even within Western Europe, French writers saw themselves as forerunners of civilization and felt free to disparage Spain and Portugal. Rivalry with England, above all in colonial context, as you know, led French writers to put British barbarism, sorry for that, in opposition to French civilization. The contrary was true also. More generally, the French, especially the French, developed a kind of cultural imperialism based on the European prestige of their court practices, social manners, theater, and especially language. The idea of a French Europe, l'Europe française, is a myth, an historiographical myth, but it is a myth who has been developed in the 18th century, which aimed at making the Parisian homme du monde the model of the universal man. The French writer Antoine de Rivarol defended the supposed universality of the French language on a double level, both empirical and normative. Widely adopted by European elites, French was reputed to be clearer, more rational, more logical than other languages. However, its universality also remained, in Rivarol's mind, fundamentally historical, linked to French cultural and political domination in Europe. I quote Rivarol, "The time seems to have come to say the French world as one once said the Roman world." In France itself, while Enlightenment had made great progress among the elites, philosophers were distressed to see that ordinary people remained in the grip of prejudice. Excuse me. And they called this part of the ordinary people the rebel or the multitude. And they thought they had to transform this multitude into an enlightened public, and they knew that it would take a very long time. So the history of civilization thus unfolded on several scales: the globe, the European continent, the nation. Universalism implied a progressive widening of knowledge which would allow individuals to reason and feel for themselves. But it was not given. It was the result of a historical, social, and cultural process. Faced with this historical universalism, several authors have developed yet another approach to universality, as this time a critical tool against the prejudices, abuses, and contradictions of civilized Europe. This is the third language of universalism that I wanted to discuss with you today. This questioning of Europe, and indeed French exemplarity, by putting forward a point of view grounded in cultural and anthropological diversity, had, of course, a longer history. It can be found famously in Montaigne's text on the cannibals, Montaigne's relativist skepticism. You know, everyone calls barbarism what is not of his own custom. This skepticism belonged, however, to an intellectual context different from that of the Enlightenment. In the 17th century, as Stefan van Dam has shown, libertine authors developed a skeptical geography in opposition to the Christian universalism of the missionaries. This critical gesture then took yet another turn at the beginning of the 18th century, especially in the dialogues of Baron de La Hontan with a savage. In this fictional dialogue, a Huron named Adario challenged the author's argument step by step and demonstrated the contradiction and hypocrisies of European civilization. Oh, what kind of men are the Europeans? Oh, what kind of creatures? We should note, however, that Adario did not reject the humanist vision of universal reason, and he did not praise the irreductible character of Huron culture. He pleaded for well-argued, rational dialogue. His language criticized European claims to embody universality, but it did so in the name of a universal human nature. As you may know, this text is currently the subject of a scholarly debate. For a long time, it was assumed that Adario was fictional and merely voiced Enlightenment critique, but David Graeber and David Wengrow recently argued that these dialogues accurately recorded exchanges or conversations between the Huron chief Condarioch and La Hontan. And in their view, the Huron philosophy of Condarioch would have influenced European ideas of equality, especially Rousseau's. But that's a debate I don't want to enter in today. Diderot provided maybe the most powerful version of this critical universalism. His supplement to Bougainville's Voyage was intended as a critique of European imperialism, supposedly derived from the rational and natural common sense of the Tahitians. The text, which took off from Diderot's reading of the explorer Voyage autour du monde, was a high point of Enlightenment dialogism. Its daring cannot be underestimated. While Bougainville's expedition could appear to the contemporaries as the incarnation of enlightened universalism driven by genuine scientific curiosity, Diderot challenged it by inventing two Tahitian figures who questioned the discourse of European authority and morality. First, the first part of the work, known as The Old Man's Farewell, Les Adieux du Vieillard, was presented as a warning about the moral and political effects of European intrusion. I quote in French, I have the translation. Un jour, ils reviendront, le morceau de bois que vous voyez attaché à la ceinture de celui-ci dans une main et le fer qui pend aux côtés de celui-là dans l'autre, vous enchaîner, vous égorger, vous assujettir à leurs extravagances et à leurs vices. Un jour, vous servirez sous eux aussi corrompus, aussi vils, aussi malheureux qu'eux. And then, addressing Bougainville, the old man exclaimed, « Laisse-nous nos mœurs, elles sont plus sages et plus honnêtes que les tiennes. Nous ne voulons point, and that is a very important point, nous ne voulons point troquer ce que tu appelles notre ignorance contre tes inutiles lumières. Tout ce qui nous est nécessaire et bon, nous le possédons déjà, sommes-nous dignes de mépris parce que nous n'avons pas su nous faire des besoins superflus. » The criticism of European useful knowledge, tes lumières inutiles, tes inutiles lumières, that's the text. This criticism of European useful knowledge in the name of the natural simplicity of the Polynesians was like an arrow fired directly at the heart of the model of civilization, and even at the whole theoretical and rhetorical organizational framework of d'Alembert's preliminary discourse for the encyclopedia, the great work edited by d'Alembert and Diderot himself. This self-criticism of the Enlightenment, with its Rousseauian overtones, highlighted the imperialist arrogance of the Europeans, who were convinced that their model of happiness was the only possible one. A second Tahitian character in Diderot's text is a man named Uru, and who is more subtle. In a long dialogue with a Catholic clergyman, he confronted him with his own contradictions. He proceeded dialogically in the manner of Socrates of the Antipodes, using rational arguments that appealed to the authority of nature. This part of the supplement is generally understood as a sort of primitivism, a criticism of civilization, but we can also consider, as Diderot invites us to do, that Uru is in fact the spokesman for a true universalism founded on reason, whereas the claims of the European clergymen are based on arbitrary moral principles. Through the voice of the fictional Tahitians, Diderot contrasted the innocence of the natural life of the Polynesians, whose morality was entirely dictated by the code of nature, to the hypocritical values of a corrupt European civilization. The universalism of human nature, valid at all times and in all places, that is Uru's words. This universalism served here to criticize European culture. What distinguished this position was the very gesture of criticism itself, which did not begin with a theoretical reflection on men in general, but which was anchored in a specific, if fictional, situation of enunciation, in which the author aimed at questioning the universalist claims of European culture in order to contrast them to another superior universalism. The use of fiction was essential for decentering and deconstructing the European version of universalism. The author, Bernardin Saint-Pierre, adopted a similar process in his Indian cottage, La Chaumière Indienne. In this short novel, a pariah living on the margins of society, embodies wisdom and justice, and is contrasted to a corrupt Brahmin. True humanism is based, in this version, is based on the experience of misery and solitude, not in access to knowledge and worldly politeness. The conclusion, in the words of the pariah, was, unable to be an Indian, I became a man, rejected by society, I found refuge in nature. Unable to be an Indian, I became a man. This critical universalism was often expressed in fictional forms, like in the examples I just gave you. European writers tried to give a voice to those who did not fit the traditional model of universality, non-Europeans and also women. Thus, the sentimental novel, a popular form of women's writing, challenged the connection between reason, masculinity, and universality. From Françoise de Graffigny to Isabelle de Charrière, several women novelists used the epistolary genre to challenge dominant conceptions of the modern autonomous individual as masculine and rational, and to suggest ways of building a common world on the basis of subjective forms of attachment. Similarly, this critical universalism could be turned against the French claim to embody civilization and reason. Herder is undoubtedly the one who took this criticism the furthest, proposing an alternative philosophy of history. Maybe some of you may be surprised to see Herder cited among the thinkers of universalism and the Enlightenment, but it is only because Enlightenment universalism has been wrongly identified with Kantian rationalism or Voltaire's model of cultural uniformity. This historiographical operation, as Avi Lifshitz has pointed out, was radicalized in the 20th century by the German historian Friedrich Minecke, then later by Isaiah Berlin. But it does not correspond to the current state of research, which, on the contrary, emphasizes the plurality of the Enlightenment and its consideration of historical and cultural diversity. Actually, if we take seriously Herder's criticism of French court civilization in the name of the universal dignity of each culture, and if we see in it, in this criticism, as Sankar Mutu did, one of the theoretical pillars of the anti-imperialism of the Enlightenment, then we must recognize that this criticism of uniformity in the name of the specificity of languages and cultures is indeed one of the languages of universalism that we have inherited from the Enlightenment, particularly through the long history of cultural anthropology in the 19th and 20th century. I'm going to my conclusion. I don't have time today, of course, to fully explore, as I should do, these three figures of universalism. I'm very sorry because it's very sketchy, but I want to emphasize that each one carries contradictions that are difficult to solve. Cosmopolitan universalism implies a definition of human nature, and this means deciding on the boundaries of humanity, a question so essential to all Enlightenment thought. Often limited to Europe, Kantian cosmopolitanism is not immune to racism, as it is based not only on a moral universalism, but also on a much more problematic anthropology, fraught with prejudice. Conversely, by considering the equality of individuals solely from the perspective of their shared rationality, this universalism prevents us from effectively thinking about much of the historical and cultural depth of society. This tension, which lies at the heart of Kant's work and interpretations of it, makes cosmopolitanism more of a utopian project than a genuine moral and political program. As for historical universalism, it readily introduces a condescending and ethnocentric paternalism, which seeks to establish a particular historical reality as a universal model. It can quickly shift towards justifying colonization and theories of assimilation. And this was particularly the case in France, where it served at the basis for both the civilizing mission in the colonial empire in the 19th century and for Republican universalism, especially nowadays, with its desire to erase cultural differences within the national community. But that is another story for another day. Finally, critical universalism can drift toward forms of moral relativism or even glorification of violence. Auroux's philosophy in Diderot's text justifies, in some ways, incest and eugenics in the name of nature. Sade, later, took the same type of reasoning even further to the point of absurdity, using real or supposed ethnographic examples and the authority of nature to justify the crimes in the name of a supposed universalism in the pursuit of individual pleasure. So, and I know I'm very quick here, but we can have discussion. Let me be clear that in highlighting these difficulties, as I have just done, I am not seeking to invalidate these universal languages, because I believe that their legacy is essential today in order to avoid becoming trapped in particular identities and in order to consider the possibility of a common world. But the essential point I want to emphasize is that an Enlightenment universalism is by no means a clear and coherent doctrine, a monolithic philosophical heritage to be defended or rejected. This universalism was plural, contradictory, and ambivalent. Its ambition was excessive, to lay down universal standards of truth, justice, and beauty, when modern experience is one of infinite cultural diversity. The grandiose project of a humanist universalism based on the autonomy of individuals and the uniqueness of human nature came up against obstacles that open up a broad field of debate involving anthropology and history. The legacy of the Enlightenment should not be confused with the dogmatic assertion of a rational cosmopolitan universalism, nor with a Eurocentric philosophy of history, nor even with skeptical questioning of the benefits of civilization. This different position coexisted and intermingled all the more effectively because none of them succeeded in resolving the difficulties they faced. Thus, they lead to a genuine conflict of universalisms, which provided the backdrop for most of the controversies that animated intellectual life in the 18th century, and I would add, since the 18th century. Of course, if I if I had the time, I would show how these three languages were important in the revolutions of the end of the century and then persisted throughout the 19th century and 20th century, but I will leave that for another occasion, or maybe for the Q&As. I hope that this detour into intellectual history will help to nuance the ways in which the Enlightenment is used in contemporary debates. If we move away from caricatures and preconceived ideas, the plurality of universalist languages that runs through Enlightenment thought may allow us to reflect on other ways of thinking about the universal today at the crossroads of two requirements: the maintenance of a humanist and rationalist horizon, which is by no means a European monopoly, and a respect for the diversity of languages and culture. Universalism should not mean assimilation into a dominant culture, nor commercial globalization, nor the standardization of the world, but rather a desire to produce common ethics and norms based on the recognition and overcoming of differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for this tour de force and taking us through these different kinds of universalisms. And the floor is now open for discussion.